Hey everyone, Anthony Fantano here, internet's busiest music nerd. You know who it is. Thank you for watching. I am back once again in a very different space. I've decided to come together with the guys from the NFR podcast, Ant and Lou.
What's going on,
What's
guys?
happening?
I've challenged these two to assemble their top 10 hip-hop albums of the 2010s. We're going to go through those respectively on each of our lists that we've made and kind of, talk about why these albums kind of land in a top 10 for us, challenge each other a little bit. And I think that's the gist of what this video is going to be. Are you guys ready?
I am ready. But listen, I have a question for you before we dive into this.
What is it?
What went into your list? Like, what were you looking for? And I ask Lou this all the time in our top 10
We'll talk about that as we talk about the records. We'll talk about what our criteria is. What our criteria is.
Let's do it.
Who's going to be brave enough to start?
Let's start off with like some honorable mentions.
Yes,
like
let's do some
children
honorable mentions
that we love that got left behind.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Okay, just list yours off rapid.
Care for Me by Saba. I got Atrocity Exhibition by Danny Brown.
Okay, wow. Danny Brown, Atrocity Exhibition off the list. Okay,
off the list, right away. Okay, Taboo by Denzel Curry.
Okay.
Swimming by Mac Miller and 444 by Jay-Z.
And you love the Swimming record.
I love
and
the
that's
Swimming
off
record.
the list.
It was tough
so there's got to be some heat on this list.
It's 10 Drake albums. I'll just spoil it for you.
What about you, Ant?
Atrocity did not make my list.
Also, wow.
But
Okay.
one of my favorites of the decade. For Your Eyes Only by J. Cole, one of my personal favorites as well. Rodeo, We Got It From Here by Tribe, and even Flower Boy by Tyler. That did not make my list as well.
Okay,
those are my honorable mentions.
All right, interesting. I also had We Got It From Here on the honorable mentions. Also had Rodeo too.
Okay, interesting. All right.
I had Igor because it's not as much a hip hop album, but it's still like one of my favorites. It's kind of hip hop adjacent for the decade. I added the Saturation series, Rock Anthem, so just like kind of that first three run
iconic
of
series
records, and also Gray Area, Little Sims.
Fire album.
So those are my honorable mentions. Those are mine.
Let's get it kicked off. Number 10. What do you guys got?
Number 10 for me has got to be, I know you guys know him. He's elusive. He's weird. It's Billy Wood's History Will Absolve Me.
Very interesting album.
Yeah.
Number 10, I think I have something a bit more mainstream, quote unquote. I have Nothing Was the Same by Drake that made my list for today.
Oh my God. That's hot, bro. Like, honestly, I don't even know if that's like top 20. If I were making my list,
I don't care about your opinion. Let's keep going. What do you got?
Number 10 for me was Rodeo by Travis Scott. Like when I think of like the subgenre that bled the most into other genres and was really at like the forefront of like pop culture from hip hop, it was trap music. And when I think about the peak of trap music and psychedelic trap music at that, Rodeo is just like the shining album to me.
Right. I mean, obviously he's on my honorable mentions, but Travis in a top 10 for the decade is totally valid because of his influence and the artistry he showed on records that.
Absolutely.
Honestly.
This was actually an album that I was considering to take the number 10 slot over Nothing Was the Same. But ultimately, I do feel like Drake does provide a bit more as far as the performance goes than Travis Scott. And I'll explain it for different reasons. You have some of the biggest anthems of the decade on this album with songs like Pound Cake or with something like A Tuscan Leather. Those also being some of the best intros and outros of the decade as well. And I love this crossover of Drake going back and reminiscing with all the time warping effects into the production, having Boy Wonder on the project.
I mean, all this is true and fair, but I imagine this is not the only Drake project we're going to see on your list.
No, this was the only one that made my list.
Oh, wow.
This was the only one that really made my list. I do consider this to be his best album.
All right.
I do think it is a complete body of work. It's a great concept album, especially for the mainstream, and you can't deny that it's iconic. I had to include it today.
All right, well, number 9.
Number 9 for me was actually Gray Area by Little Sims. Another honorable mention from you. And I just think in terms of live instrumentation, in terms of her ferocious cadences on songs like Boss or Venom, she really showed the world, in my opinion, that she was to be taken seriously as one of the best MCs in the game. And cool themes also about just her navigating throughout her life and, reaching that point of adulthood and also sort of adjusting to the tour life and getting personal on songs like Flowers. So overall, great record in my opinion.
Really raw album too. What did you have for number 9?
At number 9, I have 444 by Jay-Z.
Yes, sir.
So this was going to be an honorable mention for you.
Yeah.
I love the maturity from Jay-Z on this record. The No ID production is absolutely flawless.
How personal and revealing it is.
Absolutely. It's also a very tight and concise track list, and
the production is also really low key too in a way.
It really is. It's
super
more minimalistic.
It's not over the top like the Blueprint stuff or anything.
The more eccentric, I say, production that you do get on is something like Bam, for example, where that's more of like the banger of the album, or even like the Beyonce vocals on something like Family Feud. But example, like Jay-Z talking about the value of family and talking about family dynamic on Family Feud, or even talking about, you know, the benefits of generational wealth and setting your family first before anything on something like Legacy, or taking you back to like that blueprint content matter with something like Marcy Me, but now in more of like a mogul like retrospect, I think is genius. I think it's one of my favorite albums of the decade. And even like if I had to make a personal list of my favorite listens and the albums that I've played the most, this is definitely in my list.
All right, number 9 for me is a record that, you know, I think both of you guys have enjoyed. It might be on your list too, but maybe a bit higher. I think the cohesion between the two artists on this record is just like next level. I feel like they brought out a lot of great stuff from each other on this LP. The songs are on point. The verses are on point. Some of the best performances we've heard from this rapper thus far on this record. That's got to be Freddie Gibbs and Madlib Pinata.
At number 9.
Okay,
not higher on the list.
I have it higher on my list. Okay, interesting.
I figured it had to be on your guys' list, but
it did make my list. Yeah, I wanted to put it a bit higher. I'll explain that to you once I get to the number. But choice.
So many good songs on it. Thuggin', like so many amazing
Deeper,
tracks.
Lakers. You have so many great tracks on there.
Also, all of the like those film like snippets that were thrown in there really gives you that like blaxploitation 70s soul influence alongside, you know, Freddie's storytelling, which was just fucking superb on that album. So that's a great pick, bro.
All right, what do you have for 8?
Number 8, I have, speaking about coke rap, Daytona by Pusha T.
Okay. Yeah.
To me, it's the best album out of that good music run that we had in 2018. And I think that in terms of just like the coke metaphors and all of the one-liners and all of sort of the ethos of Pusha T was perfectly summed up into that one album. 7 songs, all slappers, not a single miss all throughout, and I had to include it.
Yeah, my number 8, I brought in Swimming by Mac Miller, so you're asking Lou before why he didn't include it, but it still is one of my favorite albums of the 2010s decade, and I love the concept of Mac Miller trying to keep his head afloat, especially through that whole swimming phase, and I'm happy you did the Redux and you enjoyed it a bit more now and that you've been able to dive into the album, but I think as a concept record, Mac Miller strives at being more melancholic and also like kind of being in this depressed state and mood and almost being like a therapist for you. I think the relatability factor is probably the strongest point of this album, where if you're having a bad day or you're having second thoughts about yourself, or, you know, whether you're in that state of mind, this is the album that you want to put on. And I do think it is 2018 album of the year. It's one of the strongest albums of the latter half of the 2010s decade, so I had to include it on my list.
Number 8 for me, you guys were asking me earlier, like, what are certain artists that I think are kind of like associated with me because I've kind of like, you know, championed them harder than maybe other websites have and stuff like that. And this is certainly an example of that, but I chose the kind of the self-titled sub pop debut of the West Coast experimental hip hop trio Clipping.
Okay.
Have you guys heard this record? Do you know?
I've never heard of this record.
I mean, like, you know, they kind of fuse elements of hip hop music and industrial music and noise as well, but in a super creative way. They just like sample insane things. There's a song on the record, and maybe I'll play you guys some of this tomorrow, where, you know, the entire track conceptually is about waking up, and the beat starts with just an alarm clock ringing. And as that is sampled and is repeating, a huge and kind of like, you know, really ornate beat builds around the sound of the alarm clock. And that's just kind of like one of many just like really weird, peculiar kind of like, you know, origins of various sounds that you hear throughout the record. Lyrically, the record is led by one Daveed Diggs, who, if you guys know, you know, played a key role in the Hamilton, you know, hip hop Broadway show and so on and so forth. You know, but before he was a part of that whole thing, he was in this trio who he still makes music with. They actually came out with 2 really good horror movie inspired concept records lately. But, you know, this Sub Pop debut that they did over here is a really creative record. It's a really unique record. It's got a lot of weird and out there bangers on it. People like Gangsta Boo are featured on it as well, because even though they are quite left field and experimental, they're very like well versed in like hip hop history and lore and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of like kind of cool and creative callbacks to a lot of classic stuff in the genre, as well as new ideas as well. And I just think it's like a really kind of groundbreaking and very unique record.
Would you say Clipping overall is like more left field than, let's say, like Death Grips, for example?
I would say that their music is obviously noisy and it's harsh in some respects, but in terms of the rapping, It's a lot more measured and I think like maybe more traditional by some
Not as
standards.
Very
abrasive.
interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Like David isn't the type of guy who's like screaming on the mic or hyper aggressive or anything like that. A lot of the harshness and oddity is usually coming from the instrumentals in the background.
Is it kind of like a Run the Jewels sort of vibe?
No, because you know I would say they make generally much more hype music.
Okay.
I mean, Clipping does have some bangers for sure, but you know, their music generally is I think a little bit more cerebral than what
Okay,
you
I
know a
understand.
duo like Run the Jewels does. Yeah.
Okay,
fire.
interesting. Nice list so far, guys. All right, fire.
All right,
All right, what do
we're
we have
at
at
number
7?
7, right? Yeah. Number 7 for me is going to be Pinata by Freddie Gibbs and Madlib.
All right.
Match Made in Heaven.
It's fire record.
Fire record. I mean, it's one that's also aged beautifully.
Yeah, it's getting better every year.
And yeah, just all of like the abstract samples, the eclectic loops,
Right.
everything weaved within that project is amazing. And also, a lot of Coke rap albums are known for their hooks, but you look at something like High, for example, with Danny Brown, and
Right.
Freddie Gibbs is actually, you know, delivering quality songwriting and catchy hooks even at that. So all around fantastic project.
What did
to
you
me.
have for 7?
7, I have Daytona. So you just
Okay,
spoke about
Cool.
this. So
Inverse right there.
yeah, absolutely.
The
This
inverse.
was an album that I really wanted to include on this list because when you talk about the Coke rap genre, I feel like this album speaks truest to this genre and especially what it provided in 2018. And I love the menacing role that Pusha T plays throughout the entire project. When you have 7 songs on an album, you know, yes, okay, you could feel like sometimes the content matter is short or you didn't get enough out of the project, but with this, all you needed was 7 songs, either if it's If You Know You Know or Santeria or even Infrared. Like, there are some serious bangers on this album, and just the Coke metaphors and the double entendres, like the setup rhyme schemes, like what Pusha T was providing for this album was top tier all throughout. And I mean, even the features were fire. Rick Ross was incredible. Kanye was incredible on the album as well. I do think it's one of the best of the
Even like the
decade.
raw emotions he was pouring into on something like a Santeria, like that's one of the most expressive Pusha T tracks. And
Yeah, and
you're
something
getting
else I wanted to mention about the production was just the sample flips, bro. Like
Unreal.
mind-blowing sample flips. And when you want to talk about just the art of sampling in hip hop, like if you go towards the 2010s decade, this album has to be in conversation as one of the best albums with like a sample-heavy production base. So I do feel like it's
Are we
one
going
of
to
the
see
best.
any good music releases on your list, Anthony?
You know, let's
'Cause you,
just
you had Kids See Ghosts at a 10, so I'm expecting to see some of that in there.
let me let's just continue on. Let me go to my number 7. That is going to be the Big Crit record, Forever's a Mighty Long Time.
Oh,
The
yeah.
Nice
double
pick.
Genius.
the
Nice
double
pick.
album that he did. I feel like the epic larger than life production on that album, the way he was able to kind of build on and just make so much bigger a lot of the sounds and themes and vibes from all of his previous mixtapes and records on that LP. Plus it's like the first time he did a studio album, because obviously in the front leg of his career, he had all those mixtapes that were just great and bangers. But then when he tried to make the transition into like the studio album field, he kept faltering and just like couldn't seem to manage to do it until he got to this record. And it just so happened that it ended up being the biggest album of his career in terms of like output. I mean, in terms of like just the length of it and the size of it. And also in the second half, you had all those cuts that had like, you know, more tuneful choruses and more gospel influences. It just kind of feels like you get really the deepest sense that you possibly could of who the guy is artistically on this album, more than any other project he's
It's one of the
put
best
out so
double
far.
albums in hip hop of all
Yeah,
time.
yeah,
to be
and that's the
honest
thing.
with
It's
you.
all, yeah, like you said, it's one of the better
yeah.
double albums in the genre too.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I think in terms of even just like expressing like your duality as an artist, he did that perfectly with like the first half being more braggadocious and having more of like that trunk shaking type of music, trunk rattling music, and then the second half was way more personal, introspective. So
Yeah.
great pick there.
All right.
Absolutely. Okay, number
All right,
6.
6.
Number 6 for me is going to be 1999 by Joey Badass. So
Oh,
we
okay.
are including mixtapes on here. I think it's
We are.
pretty fair to say. And yeah, I think that Joey Badass peaked, fresh out the gate. I think that this is still his best record to date. I think in terms of just, being that pivotal figure to revitalize boom bap the way that he did was revolutionary.
He brought New York back.
He did. And I mean, going to songs like Survival Tactics and Killuminati and seeing that, lightning energy between him and Capital Steez, the chemistry was on point. The production, him going back and taking like some old MF Doom beats and shredding them it was just like a hip hop fan's dream, especially for someone that was experiencing hip hop in the early 2010s, sort of feeling like that was, there was hip hop traditionalism sort of fading away. Him bringing it back in the way that he did was fucking impressive.
I have it much higher on my list.
Much higher?
I have it much higher. I'm a little
Interesting.
Okay, what do you have at 6?
Well, listen, at 6, I'm going to have Undone by the Roots. And this was an album that I wanted to bring in just because I really appreciate the art and concept of this album.
Yeah.
So if you pay attention to what the Roots tried to do here, especially with Black Thought, and then after that, everyone else incorporated in the album as far as features go, they're playing the character, I believe it was, I think it's Redford, correct?
It is Redford, yeah.
It is Redford, and Redford's going obviously through the storyline, and I don't want to spoil anything if you guys haven't listened to the album because it's an absolute treat, but the one thing I will tell you guys, if you have never listened to this album, don't listen to it in chronological order. Start from the back end and go all the way down, because then what happens is that's the actual chronological order of the album.
Well, what I would say is like treat it like a dam, in the sense that you could go like top to bottom or bottom to top,
It's one of the best concept records of the 2010s decade. The production is near flawless. Questlove did an incredible job all throughout the entire album, providing beautiful productions all the way throughout. Then it's an emotionally jarring album, like it's very rare you find a concept album that really grabs you and sucks you in like a movie, but that's what Undone does for me, so I had to include it.
What's your number 6?
My number 6 is JPEG Mafia Veteran.
Very interesting
I just
choice.
feel like it's such an eclectic, wild, out there record in terms of like, just rap style and song structure and production aesthetics. And I feel like Peggy just does an amazing job of kind of melding the mainstream and the underground together on that album. And it's so jarring. It's so chaotic. It's so in your face, and it's so just not hiding the ball in any way in terms of his feelings and like his he has some really grating thoughts all over the record. Like he's combative, he's combative in a way that feels like kind of new and refreshing, while hip hop is known for being kind of like confrontational and combative and competitive. The fact that you have moments on there where he's like, wishing death upon musical figures like Morrissey, it's like, completely outlandish and out there for, that's like rappers to be even focused on that sort of thing generally. But he's like there being confrontational to, dudes like that, weirdo right wingers,
mentioning like Mike Seatown out of nowhere, like obscure,
shout out Mike Seatown, PC culture and a bunch of other things. He's just like combative toward anything that might be even a minor annoyance to him, and doing it all with great flows, clever bars, and a lot of personality.
Do you feel like it's the best album to date?
No, I think LP is on par.
Okay, so LP maybe is going to creep into that 2020s list for you, right?
I'm going to leave it pretty much. That's my JPEG Mafia. Yeah, but the 2020s list for sure.
Okay, very interesting.
Okay,
going to the
number
top 5.
At number 5, I have My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy by Kanye West.
Okay. What's your?
Doesn't want to hear about it.
We've heard about it.
That's the thing, though, is that we're not going to spend too much time on it just because we have spoken about it so many times. But I think that it's the most grandiose Kanye album, and I think that in terms of just creating, let's say, an all-star rap album, in terms of the appearances that were featured on there, the Mike Dean electric guitar solos, it's chef's kiss to me. Yeah. Fucking phenomenal.
What about you for 5?
Number 5, Pinata. This is where I ended up placing Pinata. Cracked my top 5. And what's interesting is that we ended up doing a video on our YouTube channel where we went through the 2010s decade and chose the best album from each year. And then for 2014, I ended up going Sylvia Demo over this. But when I knew I had to prepare for this episode, I'm like, sheesh, okay, let's sit down and let's get down to the bottom of this. And my number one thing that I really picked up is Freddie Gibbs' performance, bro. Because when Madlib was speaking about the production of the album, he said he needed a rapper kind of like MF Doom that was going to be able to keep up with the pace of his beats. Because if you pay attention to Madlib's production all throughout the album, it's very dynamic. You have a bunch of different time switches. The tempos and paces are constantly fluctuating. So you need a rapper that's going to be able to be in the moment and lively with that. And he said that Freddie Gibbs did a perfect job on this album, and I could not agree more. I mean, you spoke a lot about what I wanted to talk about, the concept of the album coming fully together. Not only that, but the reason why I have it over Daytona is because I feel like it did what Daytona did, but with 7 extra tracks. There's not a single skip on here. Even the song Was, let's say, which is the interlude towards the end of the album, I still listen to that song just because of the instrumental. Like, so much value, so much great storytelling from Freddie. Very emotional performance, especially for a coke rap album. included into the top 5?
My top 5: Death Grips, Ex-Military, their debut mixtape.
Fire.
There's still so many freaking bangers on this project that are still, for whatever reason, like relevant on the internet today, even though the record is 10 plus years old at this point. You know, Tachyon and freaking, you know, Beware with the Charles Manson intro. And, and some of the insane sampling on this record is incredible to me to this day, from the Jane's Addiction part to the Black Flag bits to the sample of that rockabilly cut from Link Ray. It really just, for that period in time, just like really revolutionized what weird underground hip hop could be. Mm-hmm. And there's still so few records and artists out there who have kind of challenged it or bested it in terms of really I guess like outdoing it in a way to where they're providing something that is pushing the boundaries harder than it did for that time period. Yeah. Obviously I love the record, but even my first listens to it were like, what the hell is this? Do I even like this? Yeah. It's like, I really had to like sit with it for a minute to make sense of it and really like even categorize it in a way, it's still a hard hitting, catchy, mind-blowing project to me. I think one of the best, mixtapes and obviously records and projects of the 2010s handily. So
very interesting. But I think we're going to see another Death Grips album probably on your list.
Probably.
We'll see what happens.
What do you have number 4?
Yeah.
What do you have
number
4
for me is We Got It From Here, Thank You For Your Service by a Tribe Called Quest. And I think in terms of like send-off albums, this is as good as it fucking gets.
Probably the best hip-hop swan song record ever. And also one of the best double albums.
100%. And I think that like so many people were super skeptical when this album came out, just because Phife Dawg had passed away months prior, and we weren't sure how it was going to turn out. We weren't sure if there was going to be enough of a Phife Dawg presence on the record, but there was. And I think that what was really, impressive to me was just the fact that when it came to Phife and it came to Q-Tip and it even came to, let's say, Jerobi, you're getting verses from them that are super lyrically complex, and it almost felt like they leveled up from something like a Midnight Marauders in terms of their pen game. So that was really well done. Not only that, but you're getting genius song concepts like Space Program or We the People, where they're sort of taking this metaphor of like going to Mars or going to space, and how African Americans are going to be excluded from that the same way that they're excluded from so much in society. So I think that it's socially conscious. It's definitely politically driven in the best ways that it can be. All the features, looking at something like This Generation with Busta Rhymes, that camaraderie that you had from all the old Tribe albums was also very present here, and that's something that they never really lost touch of. And the production too, super experimental. A lot of these abstract beats, a lot of unresolved like chords on certain songs like Melatonin, and just one of the most interesting soundscapes and projects that I've heard of the 2010s decade. So I had to throw it in.
W choice. We had it in our honorable mentions, but number 4, you spoke about this already, MBDTF by Kanye West.
What more is there to say, right?
What more is there to say? I'll leave you the floor with your number 4.
My number 4 would be Danny Brown, Atrocity Exhibition.
Nice.
You guys both had honorable mention. Mm-hmm. I'll talk more about it since it's on my list. I mean, I think it's one of the most, if you actually look at the content of it and, some of the really sometimes frightening and freaky production on the record, it's one of the most horrifying hip hop albums of all time. In terms of like, true. He's really going through it on this record in terms of like, just dealing with his demons, suffering through, like a lot of personal trauma and turmoil, facing down his addictions and, his vices. It's a really dark record. It's a dark record. And it's also a record about a guy who, is kind of trapped as well in this really weird vortex of fame in the spotlight because, he's a guy, Danny, who has clearly, like through projects like Triple X, made a name, a career, and a brand for himself off of being like this wild, unhinged, sort of like pill popping, party loving freak, and that pushed him to a brink, to where like he was literally endangering his own life and well-being. And, this record kind of finds him in a place where he's like kind of trapped between that rock and hard place of what the hell do? I want to keep making music, but I've built my whole life and name off of being a certain type of person, a certain type of guy. And, I've become like addicted to that lifestyle and addicted to that personality. And how do I kind of break it? How do I sort of make this call for help to
Yeah,
kind of like
especially I
distance
feel like
myself
on the
from it?
record, like he adopts it so well and
Right.
like he portrays it so well that you almost feel like the pain of him kind of like letting go of that to a certain extent. And
Right.
that middle point was super well executed through the content matter. W choice, man.
But yeah, I mean, a really crazy psychological thriller of
Absolutely.
a rap record, in my opinion. That's my
Yeah,
number
it
4.
just feels like you're watching him go down like the craziest like drug binge ever, and it feels like a ride that's just never gonna end. But yeah, great pick there. Top 3.
Top
This is
3.
where it gets serious. Number 3 is a record that you mentioned earlier. It's Undone by the Roots.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, so that's my favorite Roots album, right next to Things Fall Apart. I think that when it comes to the concept of this record, it was so well put together because, like you were mentioning, it follows a character who, due to his circumstances and due to, poor choices, ends up finding himself into the streets where he becomes a murderer and he becomes a drug dealer. And the whole album really just hones in on his emptiness as a person. And it's super bleak in the sense that the writing focuses on his suicidal thoughts and how he's afraid of going from like a man to a memory. And I just think that the writing is top tier from not only Black Thought but also from Rice Daw, from Greg Porn, and all the vocalists. And that's what's cool too, is that they're all contributing to the theme in the sense that they're all portraying the character
Yeah, they're all
in
playing
some
first
way.
person, yeah.
And what's cool is that you're getting these super well written verses over these choral arrangements and over these string quartets. And you also have a series of like instrumental tracks towards the end of the album that sort of represent like his birth. And I just think that it's one of the most unique album experiences that I've ever had with a hip hop album, and one of the most underrated. Like I don't see this being thrown on anybody's top 10 list for the decade.
Yeah, I when the album came out, I reviewed it immediately and loved it.
Yeah.
But it for whatever reason has not really
Stuck with you?
No, I would say it hasn't generated kind of the conversation long term that maybe it should.
Yeah.
It's a record that came out earlier in the decade, and I know that for a lot of people, sometimes with these lists, there's maybe more of a recency bias. But it's definitely a record that doesn't get talked about enough.
Yeah, and it's not an album that's like necessarily that has the most replay value for a lot of people because
Right.
it's a type of album where you have to sit through this.
It's also very dark.
Yeah, like you have to stick in from start to finish and kind of take in and absorb all that material. So very nice picks, guys. But okay, I think listen, for Lou and I, we have the same like 1-2 over here. I think
Yeah, we already know what's up.
All right,
but you're at number 3 right now, still, right?
Yeah, but wait, what's your 3? Did you say 3? Did you do your 3?
Oh, I didn't even do
So you
my
didn't
3.
do your 3. What the
I'm
fuck?
so
What's
fucking
your 3?
confused sometimes. My bad, guys. My bad. But okay, this is where I'm going to place 1999 by Joey Badass,
Okay.
and this might be a hot take, but I truly do believe that this is the greatest mixtape of all time. I think from a technicality standpoint, there's very few artistic performances that kind of lead up to what Joey Badass did with Capital Steez on any other project. The entire soundscape of this album is beautiful. Like, well, I should say mixtape, but everything from Static Selecta to Chuck Strangers, like just all of the sample flips and always, as you were saying before, paying homage back to MF Doom. Like, I do feel like this is a hip hop fan's dream. If I had to say, like, what do I think hip hop at its purest form is at? I think it is 1999. And I think that it's also so impressive that he delivered this album at such a young age. Like, this is a prodigy's work. Like, that's the way I do feel about this project.
And I feel like we're just so attached to it too because it's sort of like our generation's Illmatic in a sense, in terms of just getting like
that's
one of the best spitters of our time over these boom bap beats.
Like, you were mentioning Survival Tactics and Illuminati, but even going off to stuff like Penny Royale and even stuff like
Hard
Waves.
Knock.
Yeah, Hard Knock, Third Eye shit. Like, even if you understand what that project did for New York and the whole pro era movement, it just created this lane for real artists to come through in the hip hop genre again and to become, the real MCs that we always wanted because there was a shortage of that at the time. So it's revolutionary, quality's on point. I literally don't have a single flaw with the entire project, and it's one of the best mixtapes of all time.
For me, number 3, I'm putting what I think is one of the greatest story albums in the hip hop canon, if not the greatest, in terms of like a literal linear progression of like, experiences and so on and so forth. But that's going to be Good Kid, Mad City.
Awesome. Fire. Yeah. Okay. All right. So,
I mean, again, as far as like a literal story from scene to scene to scene, because obviously T-Pap's going to be on this list, but there are a lot of things about the progression of that are kind of like abstract, and you're touching upon different moments during an era in his life, as opposed to like, we literally have a character who's going through a story arc, you know, like in a very kind of clear and concise way with other characters that he's interacting with that are also portrayed, you know, in a very literal fashion in the album. So, you know, to me, that kind of makes this record almost like a book, you know, like almost like a novel in a way. And as far as albums that kind of capture that vibe or capture that essence in a way, I think this one's the best.
Yeah, and it's also cool that like he was able to like jump to the mainstream without ever sacrificing substance. You know what I mean? Like it's a very substantive record as well. So yeah, can't disagree there. My number 2 from the top 2 is To Pimp a Butterfly by Kendrick Lamar. Speaking of Kendrick, what is there to say about this album that I haven't said already? I keep just peeling back layers as if it's a fucking onion. I mean, it's one of the best put together records I think that we've ever gotten in the genre, period, 2010s or not. And I think that when it comes to the different voices that Kendrick brings to the table, when it comes to the poem that is sort of expanded upon with every
Developing
track
as it's
and
going
developed,
on, yeah.
like there's so much value with this album, and we've spoken about it at length. So that's my number 2.
My number 2 is GKMC, and I love what you said about the cinematic value of the album, because if you actually pay attention to the album cover, a short film by Kendrick Lamar, and that's literally what it feels like. And I did a TikTok piece on this, but there's actually 3 different ways to listen to this album, where you could listen to it in chronological order as the track list is intended, or you could listen to it from the truest form of the content matter, where it kind of feels like a Quentin Tarantino movie, where chronologically everything's kind of fucked up, but if you go back and piece it all together, it comes together. And then you could actually listen to it from the order of the skits at the end of each song. And I mean, you have all-time great Kendrick Lamar songs on here, like A Sing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst, The Art of Peer Pressure, top-tier storytelling tracks, as well as accessibility. You know, like this is an album that didn't necessarily have to sacrifice like rotation play for me just because of the substance. You're getting Money Trees on here. You're getting bangers like A Mad City that's still politically conscious, but that knocks in the car as well. There's just so much value out of this track list. I've spoken about it many times. It places at my number 2.
For me, number 2, it's Death Grips the Money Store.
Okay.
You guys saw that one coming, obviously. Absolutely. But, you know, pretty much the, you know, premier industrial hip hop album. I mean, it's a genre that predates Death Grips, but they very much revolutionized it and popularized it, you know, and sort of made it, you know, relevant as a style. And I think they just opened the floodgates for incorporating so many different sounds and styles within hip hop music in a way that just hasn't really been approached before in the mainstream. Of course, you know, prior we've heard fusions of, you know, electronic music and rock and noise and hip hop before. You know, guys like Chuck D talk about how, you know, hip hop at its root in a lot of respects is finding ways to kind of make noise and turn it into kind of a more musical experience, which you definitely see when you're looking at the production of a group like the Bomb Squad. But, you know, Death Grips kind of, you know, made it make sense for the internet era. And that's also kind of the thing that I think makes them a significant group in hip hop and beyond, because they're so of the saturated and chaotic and nonsensical information age that we currently live in. And you hear that not only in their sound, but also the content of their music as well. So, you know, I think, that in a lot of ways, just like Kendrick, you know, they're kind of commenting and kind of reflecting like a mirror the time that they exist in, but just from a very different angle. You know, it's not so much, you know, the experience of a young boy who's kind of like struggling to find and know himself from Compton, but it's more about, you know, just kind of like being weirdly terminally online, you know, which a lot of us, you know, have to deal with and are kind of doing in and day out. And, you know, for better or for worse, is kind of like, you know, destroying our society in some ways. You know, we've seen so much, you know, misinformation strewn across the internet over the past few years, and how that's, you know, rocked things and ruined so many things socially and politically in the world that we live in, and you know, and desensitized us as well, which is like what, you know, tracks like I've Seen Footage are all about. You know, and that song came out in freaking, you know, 2011. Or no, 2012.
The content matter is extremely advanced for the album.
Yeah, it's just like, to me, like I just, it can't click with me. I'm not at that point. Like after multiple listens, it just still sounds like loud noises to me.
Yeah,
like,
no, and it is.
And maybe it's because I don't like
and it is
glitch hop too much, which you get on songs like Get God or whatever.
Yeah.
I can't gravitate.
I mean, I'll say prior to this record, I already had a history of liking a lot of loud, aggressive, chaotic music. So, I mean, this for me, you know, I kind of took to it in that sense. But then as I heard it more and more, I was like, okay, wait, this isn't just like weird, noisy ear candy. It's like kind of it's like a roadmap to the internet dystopia that we were on the way to, you know? And then when you're sort of like looking at things at a peak of, again, misinformation, you know, weird global internet government influences and shit like Jan 6, like the chaos that we're currently in is the chaos that this record was kind of like, you know, foretelling in a way. And now we're here and it sucks.
Yeah.
I'll say this. The album was better when it was just an abstract idea and not the world we were currently living in. And now it's the world that we're living in. And I wish it was still just an album.
Yeah, I feel that. Okay, so here we are. Number 1 album of the 2010s decade. Do you have any guesses for what it could be for me?
No.
No guesses? No?
Jeez.
You don't got to think
is
too hard.
Is it The Life of Pablo? I don't know.
Good Kid, Mad City. Good Kid, Mad City by Kendrick.
Yeah,
the most cinematic experience that I've ever had with an album. And I just think that like Kendrick was on a mission with certain songs on there, like a Poetic Justice, even if you go through the writing there, where he really wanted to make a record that was going to be universally heard by the masses, which he accomplished, while still weaving in these powerful messages that need to be heard by communities at large. And that's what I think he accomplished, just all of the timeless themes of the dangers of peer pressure, the fact that you don't need to be a product of your environment. Like, despite you having bangers that you can play in the club like a swimming pools, you also have Sing About Me, I'm Dying of Thirst, which is, in terms of like just perspective shifting, one of the most groundbreaking records. I love the album from front to back. I think that it's also just one of the greatest hip hop records of all time, despite any decade. And it's truly the album that made me become a hip hop head.
Oh,
so very interesting.
Yeah.
My number 1 is going to be To Pimp a Butterfly by Kendrick Lamar. I wanted to save it for yours. So my 1 and 2 is Kendrick. And I think that it's for a good reason. Like, when you look back at that Kendrick run from 2012 to 2015, it's one of the greatest from any rapper of all time. And I think that in any list, you have to include those 2 albums. Regardless of the positioning, they have to be within your list. I think that Kendrick does so much on this project, especially like if you pay attention to the poem being weaved into the track list, you know, and then after it, closing in with the interview with Tupac and like how that was kind of like a full circle moment towards the end on Mortal Man. Then even the production is absolutely fucking groundbreaking. Like, I mean, it's not the first time someone's done a hip hop, neo soul or jazz album, but all of the live instrumentation and the way that it was also fused with G-Funk was just absolutely genius. And from start to finish, this is an album that you need to be locked into. Wesley's Theory was the perfect way to start off an album. Ending it off with Mortal Man, as I was saying, is another slapper. Well, I wouldn't say like banger, but it's just like it's a slapper in the context of the track list. But even going on to something like How Much a Dollar Cost, where, you know, God is being portrayed as a homeless man in Africa, and how Kendrick plays that into the overall vibe of the album. Like, even if you pay attention to the song structures and the way that the track list kind of like presents itself, there's the whole like butterfly, cocoon, and caterpillar sort of format going on with it, which I think is absolutely beautiful. And to pimp a butterfly means to pimp something that's beautiful, to abuse it until it's nothing. And I think that concept was perfectly portrayed on this album.
Yeah, or to exploit it.
Absolutely.
You know, because obviously the entire record is about sort of, you know, art, expression, so on and so forth, and commercializing it, you know, and sort of like selling your soul, selling out, you know, cheapening your art and your creativity. It's my number 1 too. So, you know, it's my number 1.
You think it's a bad take to have good Kid, Mad City on top of it? Like, how do you feel about that?
No, I think it's valid, honestly. I think it just depends on what you're looking for. I think both albums are amazing. They just provide like different experiences.
Yeah.
You know, I think T-Pab is, you know, more like an overwhelming fever dream. You know, we were kind of talking about how kind of cartoony Eminem's old stuff used to be. To me, this record is a little cartoony as well, especially when you're talking about like the way George Clinton's vocals like come in on Wesley's Theory and so on and so forth. He just seems like such a huge, colorful, larger than life character. And that's sort of the thing. It's like, you know, you have the various voices throughout the album, be they him, be they Snoop Dogg, be they whoever, just like kind of popping in and adding like this other little bit of extra narrative color to whatever he's saying or rapping about, to sort of, you know, just provide another angle or another, you know, another person, another energy, another something. But yeah, it's an incredible record, just groundbreaking production, super conceptual, very satisfying, very dense and very thorough of an album that just kind of, you know, gives you multiple angles to one guy's kind of, you know, nightmare navigating and kind of making sense of, you know, the limelight and the music industry and kind of as you guys were kind of saying, like making a career out of what he's doing, but without making the kind of compromises that would make his art worse.
Yeah, and you even get songs like You, for example, where like the cinematic value is at an all-time high, where like you have the maid knocking on the door and you hear like the bottle clanging, and then Kendrick comes in with the crying voice and the production takes a switch. Like all those little moments add to the album experience for me, and I think that when you have to look at the album as a whole, there's not a single flaw. Like there's not a single flaw within this project, in my opinion. So, how did you like our list, man? How's everything?
What are you
It was
saying?
good, fun. This was fun going back and forth.
Yeah,
And who do you think had the better list between him and I?
Who had the better
Who had the
list?
better
I,
list
mean,
this year?
I think I probably agree with your list a little bit more, but I mean, I think you guys both had good lists, honestly.
All
Love you,
right,
Lou.
appreciate that.
Yeah, but I mean, I think we had a couple more common.
Yeah, we had some common ground here. Besides like the Death Grip stuff, which I'm actually trying to get into more and more. I've been trying to challenge myself. It's very challenging, man. It's extremely challenging to get
Maybe I'll
into.
bring a couple tracks tomorrow for the thing. Even though I know you guys are probably heard enough just to be like, I know what this is, but maybe I'll throw a few in there.
Oh, I'm always down. If you got some good recommendations for me, I'm super down to go through it.
All right, well, thanks guys for coming through and doing this. This was fun.